All right. All right. Good morning, CRESTCon. Thank you for joining us here today. It's great to see everybody in person, as this is the first CRESTCon after the pandemic. I had the privilege to attend many of the CRESTCon conferences, either as an attendee or as a speaker. And what I love about this community is that how the community comes together to share their experience and learn from each other. After all, we say that we're all in this battle together. In today's session, we hope as well that we'll share our experiences of responding to highly sophisticated double extortion, complex cyber attack. For those of you who don't know us, we are a cyber consulting incident response company. What we do in life is working with organizations to build resilience and also to respond to cyber attacks. And Sygnia will respond to all sorts of attacks, from highly complex nation-state actors to data breach to financial crimes to insider threat. Barely a week goes by when you don't notice any kind of complex ransomware attack hitting on a prominent company. Now, you sitting here may have experienced those sort of attacks in your organization. Others, fortunately, did not experience that. But in Sygnia, we live and breathe on a day-to-day basis tackling these sort of situations. In the past 1 year or so, we've partnered with more than 100 organizations working and helping to defeat the ransomware attack. So this is what we're going to do in the next 20 minutes. We will take you through a contemporary, highly complex double extortion ransomware attack. We will examine how the attack unraveled to the attacker's perspective. Then we will go into the high-level investigation process and the review of what happened. After that, we will take you towards the tactical mitigation and strategy, which will be more about what organization can do with their current structure to enhance their preemptive stature to proactively preempt these kinds of ransomware attacks. Or you can say how to make the organization ransomware ready. So by this, I'll introduce over to you, Yotam, one of my colleagues, who will run you through this example.
Thanks, Azeem. Great. So we'll jump straight in. As Azeem said, we want to start with an example of a real-life ransomware attack that we responded to. Now, obviously, the name of the organization here has been changed, and I'm not going to reveal specific details which can reveal our client, but generally speaking, the facts of the case are real. So this attack is something that we've seen very commonly in the last 2 years. It started by targeting home environments. So essentially what attackers did is use open source tools, in this case Shodan, to scan the internet looking for vulnerable home routers. Okay, there's plenty of them. I don't know how many of you patch your home routers. I don't. And then once they identified tens of thousands of vulnerable home routers that are accessible pretty much to anyone, they again used open source tools, in this case RouterSploit, which you can see here on the left, which is essentially an exploitation tool. This gave them access to tens of thousands of homes, mainly targeting the US in this case, but obviously the same thing can work anywhere around the globe. And once they had this initial access, of course, home environments wasn't their end goal. But given this initial home access, what they could do is start looking at the network traffic coming from these different homes and identify the one thing they were looking for, which is VPN access using work from home infrastructure, architecture that people are leveraging obviously a lot more during the last 2 years, but generally speaking is becoming more common. And once they identify connectivity from home environments that were compromised directly to corporate environments through VPN infrastructure, they leverage a specific VPN configuration called split tunneling in order to start targeting organizations. So in this case, the way that it worked, very, very simply, once they identified that there is a connection to a corporate VPN, they moved laterally from the router that was compromised to the work laptop under the network. In this case, they did it using DNS poisoning, but generally speaking, given a compromise of a home router, it's not very difficult to go from there to a device in the network, unless it's very well protected. But given this perfect man in the middle, it's usually doable. And then they leverage the split tunneling. So essentially, the way split tunneling works is it enables communication with the corporate VPN and with the internet in parallel. So if you're home and you're browsing, if you're doing something that's on the internet has nothing to do with the corporate environment, it's going to go straight out to the internet. And if you need the corporate access, it's going to go to the corporate environment, and that way it saves volume and traffic from the corporate environment. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that this enables attackers to establish a persistent C2, a persistence command and control channel, directly through the home environment into the corporate environment, but bypass most defenses that are in place or detections that are in place, because corporate firewall does not get involved when the attacker is communicating from a home laptop directly to the internet. But they can use that as an initial foothold into the corporate network, and this is the way they initially started this attack. Notice this is about 24 hours in, meaning from the point they compromised this home router, it was a very quick process to get from there to actually running code within the corporate environment. Now, we're not going to run through every technical part of the attack, but this is not a very sophisticated network. It was a standard Windows Active Directory network. They were able to compromise credentials and move laterally quite quickly until they reached SCCM within the network. Now, we're seeing with a lot of ransomware actors that their method of choice for deploying ransomware and encryption is very commonly living off the land. So it's quite rare to see highly sophisticated ransomware attacks. Ransomware attacks are, generally speaking, not sophisticated. They follow a playbook, and these playbooks are quite similar from case to case. They use similar tools, and they use simple mechanisms. So in this case, they live off the land by using SCCM, which is this organization's chosen IT deployment tool, and they use it in order to deploy their ransomware across the organization. It's easy, right? You already have a tool that can do this. It's just like using a GPO or running a bunch of ps-exec commands from a DC. It's something that we see happening all the time with these attacks. And once they deploy their ransomware, this is when they step back and they move to their monetization phase of the attack. So the organization is essentially experiencing their what we call the hell of a day. This is when they come in and figure out that something's wrong a bit too late, when things are already being encrypted all across the organization. And once they have this information, they also receive this ransom note. Now, I mentioned before the name of the organization here is fake. We changed it, but the rest is a real ransom note that we've seen in the past. And essentially, there are a couple of interesting key points to notice about this ransom note. The first is obviously the demand itself. So we can see here, they're telling us the demand is 3,000 Bitcoin. Now, right now, that's actually not such a bad deal. Bitcoin is very low, but generally speaking, at the time, this was about $15 million, the initial demand. And we have a deadline, so in this case, 72 hours. Now, the deadlines in these kinds of cases vary as far as what exactly they're threatening to do. In this case, all they're saying is, we break you, whatever that means, but essentially the deadline is, in theory, the last time up to which you can pay to get a key to decrypt the data. Otherwise, they could delete the data, keep doing damage to the environment if you're trying to recover, et cetera, et cetera. There's no mention at this point of data exfiltration or publication of data at the end of this time frame, but that's actually something quite common, regardless of whether the attack is a double extortion attack, which also involves exfiltration of data or not. In many cases, that indication is not going to show up in the ransom note, but only later during ransom negotiation, because they like having this 1-2 punch process where it's not all out in the open from the get-go, but they put the organization into a certain position in negotiation, and then they say, oh yes, and we also have all this data that we're going to release later. So different ransom groups operate differently, but this is quite common. Now, in this case, this attack was quite rapid, their movement towards encryption, because it was really quite easy within the organization. And this is when we got called in. And when we get called into a situation like this, we start mobilizing our response efforts across several parallel work streams. There's a lot of things that have to do with crisis management that are not necessarily technical. So obviously, there's things that have to do with talking with regulators and with the lawyers and making sure that there's a war room and a cadence for updating the board of directors and management. And there's a lot that has to do with the press and all that stuff. Of course, that's a key part of incident response, the overall crisis management. But today, I want to focus mostly on our technical work streams. And here, a key point to us is that in a ransomware attack, we want to initiate them all quickly, and we want to do them in parallel. And there are essentially 3.5 key technical work streams that we focus on here. I'll mention the half at the end, and you'll understand why I call it that way. But the first is obviously containment. So in a ransomware attack, the attacker is trying to do damage, right? They're encrypting data, so we want to move as quickly as possible to protect data in areas of the environment that have not yet been impacted. So this means either segmenting areas of the network, taking servers down. In this case, they use SCCM. Not all devices in the network received the SCCM package with the ransomware, so not everything was yet affected. So we move as quickly as possible to contain the damage and make sure that it doesn't get any worse, doesn't put the business in an even worse position. Now, in parallel to this, obviously, we want to start investigation. Now, the forensic investigation is, of course, the core of any incident response effort. And the idea here is not just to determine how the attackers got in. the whole story that I told you up until this point. Of course, we don't know it when we just start our investigation, but it is a key question. But also, we want to get to a point where we understand the full scope of compromise, every part of the attack, so that when we kick them out, especially if the organization makes a decision not to pay the ransom, we can be sure that we did it well and they're not just going to be back there in 2 hours doing more damage after the organization thinks they already recovered. So containment, investigation, and then third is, of course, recovery. Now, recovery is an interesting point because, as I just mentioned, in order to really do full effective recovery, we need first to be pretty advanced in our investigation. We need to know what happened. We need to know where the attacker is, what they left behind. However, we don't want to wait with recovery at all. We want to start it in parallel to these other efforts. And the way we do that is by implementing what we call a secure island approach. So essentially, this approach means we start recreating critical services from backup. We start recreating what we can in a completely segmented, separate network. If stuff can run independently there, great, let's have it running. But even if not, we want to have it as ready as possible so that when the investigation progresses, when we're able to clean the network and reconnect, it's just a click of a button. It's not now starting recovering from backup, figuring out, oh no, the backup's 2 years old and it's worthless. We want to get that stuff going as quickly as possible, and that's why all of these things happen in parallel. Now, in addition, I mentioned there's 3.5 technical work streams, and the reason that I call it 3.5 is because the fourth key work stream is not purely technical, but they're very, very highly connected, and that's tactical negotiation. So for us, when we come in to do incident response, this is a key part of the way we respond to ransomware. We leverage our own expert negotiators. These aren't people who are necessarily cybersecurity experts. You know, they don't have the technical skills. They have years of law enforcement experience doing ransom negotiations. And the reason this is so important for us is because regardless of whether or not the organization is planning to pay the ransom, which of course if they are, then negotiation is going to help reduce the price. But regardless of that, there are two key benefits to be had from engaging early and effectively. The first is, of course, buying time. So the attackers want to get paid, so you have a conversation, you can delay deadlines, you can make 72 hours into a lot more, and that very often happens, as it did in this case very effectively. Second, and very, very importantly, is getting information. So the tactical negotiation for us works in tandem as part of the technical team. Because what we do is we try to get information from the attackers about what they have, what they've done in the network. They want to share it because they want to get paid. We feed that back into our technical investigative teams, and vice versa. So when we can catch attackers in lies or incomplete truths through our technical investigation, we can feed that back into our negotiating work stream, and then use that as leverage to buy even more time, get even more information, and it's very effective the way that we do it when it works together. So that's why it's critical for us that these work streams all happen in parallel: containment, investigation, recovery, and negotiation. Now, with that, I don't want to touch about really every technical detail of this incident response. It's quite long, but I do want to give you some interesting examples of things that we did here. And the first is a very interesting methodology that we like to employ in cases where we have poor visibility. So this organization didn't have great visibility into what's going on, and we didn't have a great understanding of where the attacker was around the environment and what they were currently doing, because the environment is still compromised. So what we did is, when we started identifying malicious attacker tools, in this case mostly web shells, which they deployed across the network, essentially their own malicious web pages added to legitimate websites so that they can run code through them as their main lateral movement tools. Instead of removing these web shells as we found them, which probably wouldn't have done much because the attacker still had a lot of access, they could have just redeployed. Instead of that, what we do is we do tapping, or essentially modifying the attacker's code, modifying the attacker's web shells to include our own code. And now their tools are working against them. Their tools are working for us, because now anything the attacker does through these web shells becomes perfectly visible to us. We get immediate live alerting about everything they're doing. If they're doing something that could potentially pose a new immediate risk, we can stop them right away because we're looking at it live. But if they're not, we can get a lot of valuable information. And in this case, it paid off, because one of the things we saw is the attacker tried to compromise and encrypt some additional machines which weren't initially compromised in the environment. And they did it using Windows BitLocker. Now, Windows BitLocker uses symmetric encryption, not asymmetric encryption. And that means the same key used for encrypting these servers can be used to decrypt the same servers. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and say this was the key they used for the entire organization. We didn't just get the key for free. But it was the key used for a whole bunch of servers, and leveraging this new information, we can only understand where they were moving in the environment, but we could also start decrypting servers without the use of backup or paying the attacker. So this was really a very effective method for us of gaining an understanding into the attack and what's going on. Now, I'm going to move a little bit forward. Given this information, we kept on in our investigation until another pretty dramatic finding, which is this. Now, I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with this thing you're seeing on the left. This is it looks kind of funny, but this is a real forensic artifact. It's called RDP cache, and it's essentially visual cache of remote desktop sessions left behind by users, in this case by the attacker. And this is very useful for us because in this case it enabled us to see that the attacker was at this stage, about a little under 3 days in, was starting to move towards data exfiltration. Now, different ransomware attacks operate in different ways. And in this case, because everything was moving so fast for them initially, their initial attack didn't target much data. Also, this organization didn't have a lot of critical data except for in very specific databases, which were pretty well protected. But now we saw that because they weren't yet paid, they started moving towards these databases and the keys that were protecting them. And this is, of course, a game changer because once data is out, it's out. It's no longer a question of securing the environment. There's nothing we can do. The only way to prevent its publication will be payment, and that puts the organization in a much worse position as far as ransom negotiation. So once we see this, we move as quickly as possible. It's essentially a race against time to protect this critical data. So we take some databases down, we rotate keys, we remove credentials from where they don't need to be, and we make sure that at least temporarily the data is completely secure, even if it means proactively hurting our own business. So taking the services down, we do this as a decision, of course, with business leaders to ensure that it's as secure as possible. Now, given this, in this case, getting lucky, being able to prevent the worst of data exfiltration before it got too late, there's still some questions that we had open. So we had quite a lot of information about what happened throughout the attack. But the problem is because we had quite poor visibility, we couldn't really feel confident that we got everything. And in this case, the organization was leaning towards not paying. They had what they needed in backups in order to recover. No critical data was taken. However, the worry, of course, is that when you don't pay, the attacker is just going to re-encrypt, redo damage if they're still in, and then you're in an even worse opposition. So what we do here in order to expand our scope and figure out whether there's something else going on is we take a step back, and we use a methodology that we call massive binary analysis or a binary pipeline. Essentially what we do here is we collect every single binary and executable file from the entire organization. So millions of files. In this case, it was almost 12 million different unique binaries. And the idea is we take all of these binaries. Obviously, most of them are legitimate, not interesting at all. But we run them through our algorithm, which does a few things. So it cross-references it with known legitimate files, right? We know we're not interested in the legitimate Google Chrome exe, right? So we can rule all these out. Cross-references it with known threat intel engines such as VT and OpSWAT and stuff like that. And it runs it through our own malware analysis algorithm, which essentially does a little bit of running it through sandboxes. We have our own machine learning, which based on other malwares that we've seen tries to identify pieces of bad code. And what we get in the end is a ranking. For these millions of files, we get essentially a ranking from most to least likely to be a malicious file. What we then do is we have our malware analysts manually review all the top files, the ones that got high enough ranking to be suspicious to us. And in this case, this process enabled us to identify additional 4 backdoors. 4 backdoors left in different places of the network by the attacker, which we weren't aware of before, but which could have been used to do further damage if they started recovering the environment too early, let's call it. So obviously, nothing's 100%. We still don't know for sure that we know everything, but now we're a lot more confident, and we move forward towards our kill switch event. We kick out all the attacker's access. We also stop communicating with them because it's not necessary anymore. And essentially what we have here, I'm not going to run through everything, but this is an overall summary of this attack and the investigation. It was quite a quick attack, but in the end for this organization, even though it was a ransomware attack and it's not a great position to be in, it wasn't that terrible. So they had a little bit over 5,000 systems encrypted, but they were able to recover from backup under not too difficult circumstances. They didn't pay the ransom because A, they had the backup, and B, critical data was not exfiltrated at this time, thanks to the organizations and our speedy response, naturally. But a key point that I do want to make here is that once we did this, we also established with the organization some pretty advanced monitoring, both generically but also specifically targeted at IOCs known for this attacker. Because given that they weren't paid and they're still around, we know they're going to try to re-enter, and they did. So the end of this high-level timeline that you see here is re-entry attempts. Now, honestly, ransomware groups operate as a business. So once the ROI is not worth it, they move on. So once re-entry attempts fail for enough time, usually they stop. And the same group is just going to move on to someone else. But that initial time frame where they still want to try to monetize the access they already had, get back in there and do more damage, is critical. So that's why for us it's important to have that additional monitoring. And in this case, we did detect the reentry attempts, but of course, they were not successful thanks to the effective remediation and enhancing of security that we did with the organization. Now, I went through this very quickly. There's a lot of other detail that we can share about this story, of course, but the idea was just to get us a little bit into the idea of the way these attacks often look like now. This is just one example. But from here, I want to jump into some of the key mitigations and defense strategies that we see working for organizations that are handling these kinds of attacks today. Now, I'm essentially going to touch on 3 different kinds of mitigations here. And the first are the most obvious things that I'm not going to say anything new here, okay? But obviously we have to mention them in case these haven't been done. Of course, these are effective. So starting on the top left over there, external perimeter. Usually, like I said before, when we're talking ransomware, this is not usually the most sophisticated nation-state level attackers. These are businesses operating for a financial motive, and they follow the same playbooks. Their entry points are almost always either vulnerable internet-facing services or phishing. So covering these external perimeters and making sure that they're patched properly, and that has to do with the bottom left as well, but that also has to do with internal, of course. But making sure that things are up to date, making sure that there's no brute forcing that's easy to do from the outside, making sure that this stuff is secure is a very effective way of preventing most access for these ransomware attacks. And that also has for critical internal systems. So if there's high privilege, what we call tier 0 infrastructure within the organization, of course it should be protected with MFA, and the same applies for anything that faces the internet, because again, otherwise we're just making it too easy. Attackers, especially these business-like attackers that do ransomware, they just try the easy stuff. So if they can brute force something, if they can just get a user's password somehow, even through phishing, and then use it, it's going to happen. So having these things in place is very effective. Now, from that, of course, having comprehensive security stack can help prevent a lot of this from getting to its worst stages and stopping it in its tracks. So again, ransomwares are not very sophisticated. Most good EDRs are going to stop a ransomware from being able to encrypt what's going on a machine, or at least they're going to be able to detect it early enough so that you can do something about it and prevent the worst of the attack from going on in the environment. And the same apply for specific technologies to detect lateral movement, whether it's a SIM that has tailored alerts, generic alerts, both. Anything that gives you good visibility into the environment so that you can react in time. Of course, these are crucial elements that really make a big difference between the way organizations respond to these kinds of attacks. Now, finally, most obviously, when we're talking about ransomware, but also very importantly, is to protect backups. So ransomware is based on the concept of denying you access to your data. So if your data is always secure somewhere that you can rely on in a good backup, then you take away a lot of the punch of ransomware. Of course, that doesn't protect you from data exfiltration and leakage, but this is still very effective. And today, there are a lot of great solutions. We see a lot of companies, for example, using immutable backups in the cloud. So we no longer need to use stuff like tape backups, right? They're all major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP. They all provide solutions. For example, here you have an S3 bucket that's undeletable even by the root account for 30 days. So you know when you back something up there, it's safe for 30 days no matter what. Even if every single organizational credential gets compromised, their AWS roots gets compromised, still, there's nothing they can do to delete that data. So there's a lot of quite simple solutions that enable not perfect backup. Nothing's perfect, even with what I just mentioned. Of course, if they compromise backups quietly for 30 days, making sure that they're all bad, and then do encryption, then, of course, we're in trouble. But these are very good, effective mitigations. Now, from these, let's call it obvious ones, I want to jump into 2 categories. And the first category is living off the land, defending. So I mentioned before when we were talking about the attack, attackers love to live off the land. They love to use the tools that are already in place, standard Windows, Microsoft, whatever it is, tools in order to deploy their ransomware or perform lateral movement and privilege escalation. Now, that's very effective for them, but it's also very effective for us. And there are specific things that are essentially free, pretty easy to do, pretty easy to implement, that anybody in a Windows Active Directory environment can do, that are very effective in mitigating a lot of what goes on in ransomware attack. We're not going to jump into everything, but these are 4 key points here. I'm quickly going to mention them. The first and probably most important one here is protected process light. Essentially, a a Microsoft configuration that enables you to protect the LSASS process, the process that contains credentials on any Windows system, from being dumped. This is the most common way by far that attackers perform lateral movement and privilege escalation in Windows environments. They get onto a new device, they dump the LSASS process memory, they get new credentials, they use those to move to another machine, what's often known as Mimikatz rinse repeat. This will essentially prevent that from happening, because if this is enabled, by the way, Credential Guard is very similar in order to protect these kinds of credentials, then most of these attacks are going to be prevented because they're just not going to be able to access these credentials. Now, obviously, with high enough privileges, attackers can revert these configurations and remove them. But the thing is, this should never be happening in an environment. So if you have this configured, and an attacker was able to somehow get very high credentials, privileges, and get rid of this, you can have a very simple alert set up for getting rid of this, and you'll know something's going on right away. You can have an automated immediate response to quarantine the machine, and you can move forward quite easily with effective response. Like I said, we don't have much time, so I'm not going to jump into every one of these, but the bottom two here are specific configurations within Active Directory to manage critical users, so service accounts, protected users group. Again, these are simple configurations. You can just add critical users, sensitive users into these groups and use them as a means of protecting them, making sure they don't have lingering sessions on devices that can be harvested by an attacker, and preventing a lot of lateral movement. Again, I'm happy to elaborate on this later if there are questions. Now, the final category of things, besides living off the land here, is a little bit more complicated, but still very doable for a lot of organizations, and that's minor architectural changes. So minor architectural changes within a network, within an environment, we really see them going a very long way in preventing the worst outcomes of ransomware attacks. And again, I'm not going to talk about everything here in depth, but I'm quickly going to start by obviously blocking remote code execution on workstations. This is something that many organizations don't do, but is very doable because you don't need them. So this is blocking stuff like SMB and WMI and RDP directly to workstations, which most organizations don't need. But once you do this, you prevent most lateral movement avenues that attackers have towards workstations, towards either privilege escalation or actual encryption of workstations. This is very, very effective, and organizations that have this usually suffer a lot less from ransomware attacks. And the same applies for the next 2 points here, which are the tiered administration model, essentially separating the users that can manage servers, workstations, tier 0 infrastructure, having them all separate. So let's say I compromised the best workstation in the organization, I'm never going to find credentials there to access a server in high privileges. And the same goes vice versa. This is very effective. And of course, two-factor authentication on internal access to critical assets. So a lot of organizations don't have this. A lot of organizations keep two-factor authentication only for internet access, so when you authenticate online, but that means once an attacker is already in the network, they can get around pretty much anything once they compromise some passwords or hashes and other credentials in the environment. This is very effective if you have especially a PAM solution like CyberArk. This is very, very useful in preventing, again, these lateral movement options. The final thing here is something I want to spend another minute on, and that's where we'll end, which is to restrict tier 0 outbound internet access. Now, tier 0 are the most critical IT infrastructure in the organization, right? Stuff like domain controllers, or the EDR, or stuff that can really do anything in the organization. And the reason this is so critical is because we see that organizations that have this usually avoid having these things compromised in ransomware attacks. Very sophisticated attacks. Of course, if they're in the network, they can tunnel towards these workstations or servers and then tunnel back, and they're fine. But what most attackers do, especially in ransomware cases, is they deploy their tools directly to these tier 0 infrastructure. And then they expect these tools to communicate directly to the internet so that they can run code directly on them. So for example, they deploy a malicious tool to a domain controller and then use that access in order to run code across the organization from the domain controller. If you prevent unnecessary outbound internet access from these devices, which usually they either shouldn't have at all or should have it to a very small, very easily manageable list of external resources, then you prevent most of these attacks. And I'll end with a quick example, which is not from a ransomware case, but it just illustrates this so well. Not going to dive into everything in this slide, but this is very commonly known, the SolarWinds supply chain attack from last year. So essentially what happened is Russian attackers were able to infiltrate the SolarWinds network and essentially tamper with an update, a software update that was sent to thousands of customers around the world. Once customers received this, a whole attack unfolded, including first time in the wild golden SAML. It was very beautiful to see. But here's the key. We did a lot of incident response to organizations that faced this, obviously, that had been victims or targeted, at least, by the SolarWinds attack. However, one of the biggest differentiators here was whether organizations had restricted tier 0 outbound access to the internet. Because say an organization did not allow needless outbound access from tier 0 servers like the SolarWinds server, what that would have done is prevent all of this. So the organization would have still received the malicious update. They had nothing they can do to prevent that because SolarWinds were compromised. But once the malicious update was received, it had no way of communicating outside to the command and control servers run by the attackers. So essentially the attack was stopped dead. And organizations that had this well managed, this is a simple configuration. The SolarWinds server had no reason to communicate with external internet addresses except for the SolarWinds update server. The rest, the internet, could have and should have been blocked. Now for organizations that had it blocked, fantastic. And this is very effective against a lot of these kinds of attacks, especially when it comes to ransomware, which, as I said before, usually follows a playbook. Okay, so we started late, but we're going to end on time, at least with regard to where we started. So we're happy to take some questions. And then, obviously, you can also approach us afterwards.